What is up, everyone? In today's video, I'm going to be going through my full UFC 303 breakdown, making my predictions for every single fight on this card. If you guys want to jump around to specific matchups, there will be timestamps down below, but let's just dive right into it. Starting off with the first fight of the night, we have Ricky Simón taking on Vinicius Oliveira, and this is a pretty big step down for Ricky Simón in terms of competition, and it's also a pretty huge step up here for Loke Dog, who is Vinicius Oliveira. Ricky Simón's coming off of back-to-back losses, but it's been very high-level competition. A KO loss to Song Yadong, and then a decision loss to Mario Bautista. Oliveira's only had one fight in the UFC. If you guys remember, it was like the insane flying knee knockout, where he had the dude exhausted, off balance in the third, had him like up against the fence, and knocked him out like viciously. Probably would have been fight of the year if we didn't have the Max Holloway UFC 300 knockout. Super dangerous finisher, fights pretty recklessly. He has 18 finishes in his 20 wins, and then all 3 of his losses are by knockout, so he's very much kill or be killed. Before the finish in his UFC debut, his opponent was having some success in the first couple of rounds. He landed 3 takedowns. He had racked up some control time. My concern here for Oliveira is that if he's getting taken down and controlled by someone making their UFC debut, I don't feel like a matchup against Ricky Simón, is a great look here for him, especially in his second UFC fight. Like, this is definitely kind of getting skyrocketed close to the rankings here. Simón has landed at least 2 takedowns in 11 of his 12 UFC fights. The only fight that he did not land 2 takedowns was when he was knocked out in 46 seconds by Uriah Faber, and he's landed 6+ takedowns in 5 of his 12 fights. So he's shown an ability to consistently get his wrestling going. We know he has a great gas tank. I really do just think that Simón's going to have the early success with his grappling. I think he's going to zap some of that explosiveness of Oliveira early on. And then I honestly wouldn't be shocked if he could find a late finish or potentially a decision. I'm going to go with Simón by decision, but I also wouldn't rule out like a tired Oliveira getting ground and pounded to end the fight. So I'll go Simón by decision there in the first matchup. Second fight, we have Ray Tsuruya going up against Carlos Hernandez. Tsuruya here is actually a pretty interesting prospect that no one's really talking about. He's only 21 years old, won a contract on road to the UFC. He is 9-0 as a pro, 4 knockouts, 4 submissions. He has really impressive grappling, and the level of competition he's faced so far is pretty high for being so young. Like, he doesn't have like a super, padded resume where he's 4-0 fighting someone who's 2-2, 1-3. Like, he was facing reasonable competition, kind of leading up to this UFC opportunity. Hernandez is 2-2 in the UFC. He's coming off a KO loss to Tetsuro Taira. When I look at Hernandez's striking, I just don't know if it's dangerous enough to kind of stop the grappling of Tsuruya here. I think it's going to be too high level in this matchup. I'm going to go with Tsuruya by round 2 submission. Also, sorry if I'm butchering that name. It's not sounding right. But I'm going round 2 sub for him. Moving over to the heavyweight matchup here, we have Andrei Arlovski taking on Martin Buday. And on paper, this is not a super fun fight. Arlovski's lost 3 in a row. His last win was a pretty sketchy split decision. He's 45 years old. Would honestly not be shocked if this ended up being his last fight here. He's fighting in front of a crowd. I don't think he's done that in a while. Buday is coming off a KO loss to Shamil Gaziev. He had won 12 straight before that, but level of competition not overly high. He's a pretty big heavyweight, 6'4". He cuts down to make that 265-pound limit. I wouldn't be shocked if this fight was competitive, especially if it was like a low-volume kickboxing match. We've seen Arlovski get into some of those, so I think that's probably the path for Arlovski in this matchup. I just think Buday has more finishing upside. I think if someone's going to initiate the wrestling, the grappling, I think it would be Buday. Arlovski's last finish was in 2015, which is kind of shocking to think about for a heavyweight who's been so active. So I just think Buday has more ways to win. He could win a decision. He could win it by finish. I'm going to go with round 2 knockout for him, but also wouldn't be surprised if this was like, a pretty boring heavyweight decision fight. Next up, we're going to have Michelle Waterson taking on Gillian Robertson. And Michelle Waterson's been struggling here. She has lost 4 straight. She has 1 win in her last 7 fights, and even that one was a very close split decision. Gillian Robertson is 2-1 since moving down to 115. She has 2 finishes in both of those wins. Gillian Robertson has some really impressive jiu-jitsu and honestly is a pretty underrated finisher just in the entire UFC, but also women's MMA. She has 10 wins in the UFC, and 9 of those are by finish. And her fights are pretty simple. If she can get her wrestling going, she's probably going to find a finish somewhere. She's probably going to pick up a win. If she can't land her takedowns and it stays on the feet, she's probably going to be losing a decision. She's still fairly durable, not getting finished a ton, but if she can't get the grappling going, she's probably not going to win the matchup. Michelle Waterson doesn't have the best takedown defense, but it's not like it's terrible. It's not like a massive liability for her. I do think this fight's going to be close. I think it's going to be competitive, but I just feel like they're at two different points in their career. Gillian Robertson is 29. She may not have even hit her prime yet. Michelle Waterson's 38, struggling like I mentioned. I think Robertson takes advantage. I think she takes her down, and I think she finds a submission somewhere in this matchup. So I'm going with Gillian Robertson here. Shifting over to Payton Talbott taking on Yanis Ghemmouri. Let's be honest here. This is a showcase fight for Payton Talbott. He looks like a future star. His last performance against Cameron Saaiman was so unbelievably impressive. I was someone who was really high on Saaiman. I liked him. I thought it was a really interesting matchup between, two top prospects at bantamweight. But Payton Talbott just absolutely took it to him. It looked like they, weren't even in the same realm in terms of their ability. Ghemmouri's 0-1 in the UFC. The loss was kind of a weird stoppage where he got kicked. It was kind of in the cup, but the ref said it wasn't in the cup. Ended up being a finish. I just think this is Payton Talbott's time here. I'm going to go with him by round 1 KO. Could this go to decision? Sure. Could it go longer? Sure. But I feel like the most likely outcome here is an early knockout for Payton Talbott. They put him on a numbered card for a reason. They weren't giving him, a super tough test in this matchup. So I do think he gets it done. Now shifting over to Charles Jourdain taking on Jean Silva. For Jourdain here, had a pretty up and down UFC career. He's 6-6-1, so 6 wins, 6 losses, 1 draw, pretty much even there. Silva is 1-0 in the UFC. He's 11 finishes in his 12 fights, but he definitely hasn't faced close to the same level of competition. Jourdain obviously been in the UFC for 13 fights. Silva only 1. Jourdain is very durable, has a really good chin. He's never been knocked out. That could definitely be tested here by Silva. But I just think Jourdain has the experience edge. I think that durability is going to help. I think he's going to be the more active fighter, and I think he's going to get a decision here. Another kind of fun matchup, we have Cub Swanson taking on Andrei Fili. We have never seen Andrei Fili lose back-to-back fights in his career. He's coming off a pretty brutal knockout loss to Dan Ige. Cub Swanson's coming off a pretty controversial decision win over Hakeem Dawodu. A lot of people thought it should have gone the other way. Swanson's also kind of getting up there in age. He's 40 years old, which for the lighter weight classes is crazy. Once you're getting mid-30s, when you're at sub 155, I feel like you're already considered old at that point. So him still performing well at 40 is very impressive. Fili's 32, definitely the much younger guy here. But despite Swanson's age, he's still been fairly durable. He's only been knocked out 3 times in his career. One was to Jose Aldo, and then the other 2 were a leg kick KO and then a body kick KO. So the chin has really held up. Fili's definitely a finisher, but he's not someone who typically targets the body, not someone who's going to have Jonathan Martinez level leg kicks. When Swanson does lose, it's typically by sub. 7 of his 13 losses are by getting submitted, but once again, not one of Andrei Fili's strengths. So I do think Fili's going to win this matchup, but I'm going to be taking him by decision here. Even though he's a finisher, I think this one goes the distance, and I think he gets his hand raised. Now, I believe this is the featured prelim here. We have Joe Pyfer taking on Marc-Andre Barriault. Joe Pyfer is coming off his first UFC loss. It was a decision to Jack Hermansson. Marc-Andre Barriault is coming off a split decision loss. Pretty close matchup to Chris Curtis. I feel like a lot of people really buried Joe Pyfer after his last loss. The UFC was definitely giving him a push. He got a main event against Jack Hermansson. It didn't go his way, but it's not like he got destroyed. I don't think it's the end of the world. He won the first 2 rounds on all 3 scorecards. He kind of just ran out of juice in the championship rounds. Happens, he got experience from that matchup, didn't take a ton of damage. I think Marc-Andre Barriault can definitely push the pace. His nickname is Power Bar for a reason. He has a lot of cardio. He can put it on dudes. But is he going to be able to do that without getting hit hard by Joe Pyfer here? Pyfer can crack. He's got a lot of power. And even though he faded in a 5-round fight, I don't know if he's going to have serious cardio concerns in a 3-round matchup. Pyfer's finished 11 of his 12 wins. 8 of those are knockout. I think Marc-Andre Barriault is going to try to push it, but I think Pyfer's going to catch him. I'm going round 1 knockout for Joe Pyfer. Now we're finally to the main card here. We start off with Ian Machado Garry taking on MVP. And looking at these 2 fighters, I think Ian Garry is the better MMA fighter overall, but I also don't think this is a great matchup here for him against MVP. Ian Garry's 14-0, 7-0 in the UFC, coming off a win over Jeff Neal. MVP is 22-2. He's coming off a nice win over Kevin Holland in his UFC debut. And then when we're looking at his 2 career losses, one was a split decision where he was pretty much like clinch / laid on the entire fight. Didn't really take any damage, but it was just kind of like a stalemate up against the cage. Then his other knockout was like a cartoon knockout against Douglas Lima, where I think his like leg got kicked out from under him and then he got put out pretty badly, but it was just a very awkward sequence. MVP is just so unique and dangerous on the feet that if you're going to tell me it's like a pure striking battle, it's going to be tough for me to pick against him. I feel like it's so hard to try to train for that style. He's so unique. He really is one of one as a striker. I do think Ian Garry's going to try to get his clinch game going. Maybe he tries to take down MVP, but I just don't know if he has the wrestling or is dominant enough in the clinch to really gain an advantage. Like maybe he can, create some clinches, create some scrambles, but I just don't know if he's going to be able to really get an edge on the scorecards doing that. And I just don't think he's going to be able to land a ton of damage there. We saw MVP land some heavy shots on Kevin Holland. We know Kevin Holland has a great chin. I don't know if Ian Garry's taken some of the shots that Kevin Holland ate. So my prediction here, I think it's going to be competitive on the feet, but I think MVP is going to end up having the bigger moments. Maybe he gets a knockdown, maybe he hurts Ian Garry, and I'm going to go with him by submission in this matchup. In the next matchup, we have Mayra Bueno Silva taking on Macy Chiasson. Honestly, kind of a questionable decision to put this one on the main card. You have Silva coming off a pretty brutal title loss to Raquel Pennington, but, whatever. We're going to watch all the fights anyway. Prior to that, though, she had won 4 straight fights, if you're including the no contest against Holly Holm. But outside of that Holly Holm win, a lot of those matchups were pretty low level of competition. Macy Chiasson's been pretty up and down, but she's coming off a round 1 submission win. She's very physically imposing for this weight class. She's 5'11", 72-inch reach, fighting at women's bantamweight, compared to Silva, who's 5'6", with a 66.5-inch reach, and is someone who is a former flyweight and not necessarily like a big flyweight. So I definitely think Chiasson's going to be way more physical. I think she's going to be the much bigger woman in there. I guess the concern here for Macy Chiasson is that she just like runs into a submission for Mayra Bueno Silva. She is a legit submission threat. But I'm going to take the dog here. I'm going to go with Macy Chiasson to win by decision. This next matchup here is one of the weirder kind of fight histories that I can remember. It originally started off as a co-main event with Jamal Hill taking on Khalil Roundtree. Then it went to Jamal Hill taking on Carlos Ulberg. Then it went to Carlos Ulberg taking on Anthony Smith. And now we have arrived at Anthony Smith taking on Roman Dolidze coming up from 185. And Anthony Smith was taking a huge risk, stepping in on short notice to fight Carlos Ulberg. I think this new matchup is infinitely better for him stylistically. Dolidze also I just don't think is as good as Carlos Ulberg. He's coming off of back-to-back losses. Talked about how he's coming up from 185. He got beat up pretty good in that Nasruddin Imavov fight. Not a super clean striker. He definitely has great jiu-jitsu, very crafty, but he doesn't have like the consistent wrestling to get it going, in every single matchup. Anthony Smith, also not going to be the best striker, but he also has a legit ground game. I don't think he's going to get submitted by Roman Dolidze, and he just has that 205-pound frame, right? He's been at this weight class for a while. He has some big wins here compared to Dolidze, who's coming up on short notice. So I'm going to go with Anthony Smith, and I'm debating between knockout and decision. Only 3 of Anthony Smith's 37 wins are by decision, but Dolidze has also been very durable in his career. I'm going to end up going with Anthony Smith by knockout. Let's go. I'm thinking later in the fight. Let's go round 3 knockout. Dolidze, how's the cardio looking coming in on short notice? Is he going to try to push a wrestling-heavy game plan? Maybe he wears himself out a little bit. I think Anthony Smith finds a late knockout in this one. Then in the co-main event, another new fight added to this card. We have Brian Ortega taking on Diego Lopes. First off, just shout out to both of these dudes for, stepping in to save the card here. Brian Ortega, 3rd ranked dude in the division, taking a short notice fight. Someone who hasn't been super active in his career. Kind of shocking, but you love it for this card. And then Diego Lopes, I think he's ranked 14 with a massive jump up in competition here. And I don't know if I'm crazy, but I feel like this is a rough matchup for the higher ranked guy here, T-City. Brian Ortega is definitely a solid striker. He's not going to go, toe-to-toe with Volk and Holloway and win a ton of exchanges if he can't mix in the grappling, but he's still definitely dangerous. It's his jiu-jitsu that, sets him apart here. 4 of his 8 UFC wins are by sub. He's coming off of submission win over Yair Rodriguez. I think the issue here for Ortega is that Diego Lopes also has elite jiu-jitsu. He has 12 wins by sub. He has never been submitted in his MMA career. He also has 10 knockouts, so just all across the board, Diego Lopes is getting finishes. He's coming off a very impressive knockout over Sadiq Youssef, and I definitely think this could be a matchup where you have, two guys with great jiu-jitsu, solid grapplers, and it just ends up being a striking battle. And I feel like in that matchup, Lopes probably has the advantage, especially with his power. Like Ortega, maybe, he's a little bit more technical, but I don't even know if that's the case. He's just very hittable on the feet, Ortega is, and I think Lopes has more power in this matchup. Ortega got hurt pretty bad in that Yair matchup, definitely not comparing Lopes' striking to Yair, but I just think Lopes could have some of the bigger moments. I'm going to go with Lopes by decision. I know Ortega's super durable. I just don't know if Lopes can be able to finish him, but I think Diego Lopes wins this one by decision. I'm not sure if he's the dog or the favorite. I'm guessing the odds have to be pretty close on that one. But now we have the main event, the rematch between Alex Pereira and Jiri Prochazka. I would watch these guys fight every single weekend. I think in this specific matchup, it's kind of bittersweet because if we waited to get this rematch, it might not have happened, right? You never know what could happen at 205. One punch, could end a title reign, could knock someone out of their prime. So I'm glad we are getting to see this one, but we also haven't had, much time to breathe from their first matchup. And both these guys are probably not going to be 100% heading into this one. Pereira had a broken toe heading into his UFC 300 fight and then broke another toe in that matchup. Is he fully healed from that? For Jiri, he took a decent amount of damage in that Rakic fight. He also showed pretty much zero improvement in checking leg kicks, which was a pretty huge problem in the first Pereira fight. And I think Pereira is a much better leg kicker than Alexander Rakic is. I did like in the first matchup that Jiri went to the wrestling. We've seen a lot of fighters, for whatever reason, kind of go in with their ego against Alex Pereira. They think they're strikers, Sean Strickland, Jamal Hill. They want to go out there. They want to knock him out. They want to compete on the feet. And it's just the path of most resistance if you're going to do that. Even if you're a good striker, Pereira is, so much infinitely better on the feet than he is on the ground that not going to it, I think, is just doing yourself a disservice. So I think it's good that Jiri went to that. I think he probably banked the first round by doing that. But I just don't know if he's going to be able to consistently get this fight to the ground. We know that both these dudes can finish each other. Both of them can knock each other out. Pereira had Jiri hurt, obviously finished him. Jiri, I think, had Pereira stunned a few times in that first matchup. I just think the most likely outcome is that Pereira nukes him again. The power is just different. Like, we've seen Jiri eat some massive shots, and he went into that Pereira fight with a fresh chin. That was off a long layoff, hadn't just had a recent fight, and that left hook that Alex Pereira landed, lifted him up off his feet. Now we have him coming in off a fight where he took a lot of shots against Rakic. Rakic was landing some heavy blows. Jiri was just eating them. I don't think he's eating those same shots against Alex Pereira. So I'm going to go with Pereira round one knockout. Jiri could definitely find a finish. They're both kind of kill or be killed here, but I am going to go with Alex Pereira here. And that's going to wrap it up for every single fight for UFC 303. Let me know your thoughts on these picks. Do you guys have any different options? Let me know who you guys are rolling with here for the main card fights. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.